So what I want to do is take a little bit of time to talk about the interop that we just did. Give you some ideas of who was involved, what we tested, results of those tests, and our findings from that. We're doing this for a couple of reasons. One is we wanted to learn, the participants wanted to learn amongst themselves what the state of really the spec was, right? In the sense of, seems good on paper until you actually put it in code. And the other thing is we also want to be real transparent about with the community, like where we stand with V2, right? Yes, the spec has been ratified, but when you actually put it into product, what does that start to look like? And what do we think would maybe come to some good changes with the spec to help things out? Right, so who was involved? First off, we had a nice mix of both servers and clients between Google, Glue, Okta, SailPoint, Salesforce, Unbound. So some folks that have had SCIM support in the past, some folks that are new to the community too. So that was really nice to see. Not everybody tested with everybody. So what we did was we sort of just worked through pairs of tests. So these are the pairings that you'll see in terms of who tested with whom. Now in some cases, like Unbound and SailPoint, they actually tested their clients against their own servers. And that's also interesting to see the results of that. Not surprisingly, they did quite well. That's more surprising than I expected. Okay, now I'm into a weird PowerPoint state. There we go. And we had essentially 12 sections of tests. So what I'm going to show you is by section. I'm going to talk about what the test was actually doing, and then talk about the results of that. You'll see 3 categories of results. Tests that were successful, tests that failed, and tests that were unrun. And the unrun section is actually kind of interesting because it's either because the people doing the test just didn't get time to run the test, but also in some cases it's because the server itself didn't support a certain function. We didn't differentiate those things, but I just wanted you guys to have the full context of this. That's so weird. This is being sketchy. Okay, so section 1. Essentially, these tests are laid out in the order kind of like Kelly took us through in the Choose Your Own Adventure. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is hit the service provider config to figure out what the heck I'm working with. Like, how am I going to authorize or authenticate against the service? So for the most part, really good. That failure is because of the way actually I hosted our interop code. I couldn't do it immediately in an unauthorized URL. So that's essentially fixed. But for the most part, go hit the service provider config, start there. Next thing I want to do is, in this case, we went with resource type. What are the resources that are available in the server? For the most part, very good. Where we had some glitches really was more around strict parsers, clients that were super strict about what they expected the server to come back with, and some servers or the people building servers who were maybe a little bit fast and loose with their schema. That would be me. Kelly's dig was pretty accurate. It's okay, we're feeling much better now. So now we know what kind of endpoints we have. And the cool thing was that people actually extended this and added their own endpoints. So in Salesforce's case, I added a group's endpoint is in the spec. We added roles and entitlements because we have a pretty complex authorization model. Might as well start to surface that and give people a way of working with it. Next step in this case was schema. Again, people were able to retrieve schema pretty well. Where there were glitches tended to be around parsers being pretty strict, either around typing, that was one, and the other, what was the other reason? It was minor sort of just schema glitches in people, nothing major. Again, we found that people were pretty adherent to actually getting the spec going. Okay, so at this point, what have we got? If we were implementing this on our own, we know how to authenticate and be authorized to use the SCIM endpoints. We know what resource types and where they live, and we know the schemas. Okay, so next thing is, let's go build a user. And so section 4 was around creating a user. For the most part, we had good coverage. The reason why things would be unrun, because this is the first time we're seeing a considerable amount of unrun tests, is that, for example, the server didn't have any immutable type attributes. So one of the tests specifically is like, we want to see how you respect immutability. Well, not everyone had immutable attributes, so those kind of tests didn't get run. But otherwise, for the most part, as you'd expect, this was pretty good coverage in terms of what was actually run and executed, and it did quite well. Only things to note other than that were around attributes and excluded attributes, which I think are tests 4.5 and 4.6. Not everyone included the excluded attributes capabilities. So I think what we saw here was people just hadn't built that out in the server side. And one of the things we'll talk about at the end of this is SCIM is actually a lot more usable in more directions than certainly I would have thought. In the sense that, and my background was I worked on SPML, which means I'm the perfect person not to work on SCIM, because clearly if I screwed it up once, why would you let me do it twice? But in an SPML world, it was about the provisioning aspects, right? Here were the verbs for doing provisioning. And we have those in SCIM, right? We have a great protocol for doing that. But there's also a lot of capability around using SCIM like a directory protocol in some regards. So search, for example, that secure post search is a nice way to do that. So you'll see that the mix of these two give us a lot more capability. But at the same time, not every server implemented all of those things. So we've created a user. Now, next thing we want to test out is, let's go update that user. It's an eye chart. There's a ton of update things in here. One of the reasons why we didn't have as much test coverage here is ETAG support. Not many servers in here were doing ETAG, and so there's a bunch of tests in here that was around ETAG. It just didn't get as much test coverage. But for the most part, people did pretty well on update for the testing that we did. So then that was testing put, essentially. Like, let's just slam the whole user object right back in the API. The next thing we really wanted to work on, certainly I was very keen on, was patch. Now here we didn't get as much testing. Partially it's because clients weren't implementing patch, and partially it was because the servers weren't universally implementing patch. And this is, we'll talk about this at the end, patch is an area in the spec that I think needs just a little bit more tightening. Because there's the reasoning for why patch is the way it is and how it can be used makes sense, but I think there's some things we can do to tighten that up a little bit to make it a little bit easier. But the general case around it is super simple, right? It's like, why do I have to stick this huge object back in the API if all I'm doing is changing one of the attributes? Or I've got a huge group list like Kelly was talking before. Why not just add that one thing? So the kind of mindset behind it makes sense. I think what we need to do is tighten the spec up a little bit to make it easier for people to be like, oh, this is what I got to go do. So we've created a user, we've updated that user, we've updated them again through patch. Next thing is, let's just retrieve the user, single user. So this is the same one that we just created. And here we were testing out both ETAG stuff, which didn't get a lot of test coverage, as well as excluding attributes and filters. So here we were more probing the directory service aspect, if you will, of SCIM. Pretty good for what was there, right? So I think, again, same thing, ETAG support was missing in a lot of cases. Otherwise, people were pretty good. So then having retrieved a user, let's go retrieve all users. So section 8 was looking at that. Similar results in terms of coverage and passing. So pretty good. It's sort of the extent to which servers were going to implement other capabilities. One note, that last line, 8, 9 through 16, is basically do all these things again, but use post against /.search. Nobody implemented /.search, so none of those tests got run. We'll talk about implications of that in a sec. Then, what about me? Not a lot of people care about me, apparently. So there was a couple things. One, just notes to ourselves in the test itself. And one of the things I'd like to see, certainly, and I think the group is positive towards this, is use this as a basis towards a conformance test. Right? We'd like to move to a point where we can get a nice SCIM2 conformance test. And this is an important first step. But we had a bug in the test. That's the actual text of the test, which says retrieve /lowercase me. The spec, it's uppercase me. So it's one of those things where you're like, oh, geez, testing the test itself matters. Moving that aside, didn't have a lot of implementation of it. We did hear that use case that Kelly was talking about. It was the first time I've heard someone really give me a good use case for /me. And partially I'm thinking about it from, well, I already have a user info endpoint. Why do we need this other thing? But I'm starting to see use cases around that. I think it makes sense. Okay, so we can retrieve the user. Now let's go delete the user. Couple things about this. One was ETAG support. Again, not a lot of test coverage there. The failure is an interesting one. The failure is actually against my Salesforce implementation, which was 10.5. So the test goes like this. You create a user, you delete that user, you create the user with the same username, and it should fail. Excuse me, it should succeed, right? In my world, in my code, I didn't put enough insulation around it, and it actually failed. So this gets to the question about delete, right? Because delete means a lot of different things to a lot of different servers. In our world, in a Salesforce account, you can't delete an account. You can deactivate it, you can change the username, you can do a lot of interesting things to it, but for a variety of reasons, you can't actually hard delete. Now, other servers, they're all about hard delete, which is great. But there's no good indication in the core spec as to what you're dealing with or what the server's going to support. So there's actually an extension for soft delete. So we can actually be more explicit around, hey, I'm this kind of server. So if you're expecting this behavior on delete, this is what you're going to get. And so that's an extension that I think we will reheat and get some attention on again, because it started to point out this in these tests. So no one implemented, or tested for that matter, .search. And Pam had a really good observation as to why that is. We were working with junk data, right? We're working with Interop quality data. So there's I've got 65 Kelly Grizzle accounts in my org. Okay, there's not a lot of value in that. What we weren't working with is SSN number or account balance or things like that, where, you know what, those would bring along with them PII concerns, and I would want to search this in a more secure way. So that's one where, personally, I'm of two minds of this, in the sense of this makes a lot of sense, but if you're thinking about SCIM as the provisioning mechanism, this kind of stuff comes secondary in your implementation. If you remember Kelly's sort of tips for getting going, it's you're going to get to this, but you're probably not going to start with it. If your focus is, I got to build users. Now, if your focus is, I really want to treat this like a directory service, then I think you'd switch that around. You say, no, I want to do this up front because it's really important for retrieving attributes. And then lastly, there was some interesting sort of chaining of activity, and as well as group work. Not many people actually tested the group aspect of creating a group resource or deleting group resource, patching to it, patching its members, which I think is an area for further growth. I think this section needs to be built out in further tests to do more and more. So from an aggregate perspective, we can see broken down by the pair how people did. The yellowish color is unrun, blue is passed, red is failed. Couple things to point out from this. Where people were testing against themselves, so we see in the middle there, sale point on sale point, and on the right, unbound on unbound, had the highest test coverage. Doesn't mean necessarily it always succeeded, but highest test coverage. Not supremely surprising. And Kelly really found value, as he's already said, about essentially having a single library that was both client and server for them. But I would say on average, we ran about 35 of the 66 tests across the board, which was pretty good given we started this conversation, Kelly, March? Give or take, and we basically told everyone May 1 was the starting gun for testing. And the working group used this as a forcing function. There's a whole lot of people yeah, we don't even have an alpha V2 server. We're well, by May 1, what are you going to get? We're let's find out. So this was really good in that regard, that you had a lot of people really accelerate their V2 work based on this as a forcing function. Couple of outcomes. Strict parsers are strict. Yeah. So if you look at the email threads, it's sort of Ian, your schema looks like crap. And that's basically the subtext. The thing that was interesting to me is, and I think this, if you're doing this inside of enterprise, you're probably going to have the same thing that I was thinking about, which is, I'm going to talk to the server, the person that maintains that server, and I'm going to ask them what the real deal is. What's the real thing I need to know to create a user? And so in that regard, I wasn't thinking about someone dynamically pulling schema, creating everything around that, and actually using it, right? I was thinking kind of fast and dirty, which, given my programming skills, is about what we got. But I think you'll see that in an enterprise where you're like, well, I'll just ask the app owner, what's the minimum I need to do? And I will basically just kind of hard code to that. This is going to get super entertaining when my laptop dies. But at the same time, if you are an Unbound, if you're a SailPoint, if you're Ping, you're thinking, I've got to build for everything, right? So I've got to have good parsing. I've got to have a good schema interpretation. Patch definitely needs more test time, and I think better granularity of tests. And we talked about search. So sets of actions to take. There's a list of things here that we're talking about as the working group that we want to work on. Patch is definitely one of them. I was saying tighten that up to be a little bit more prescriptive about things. Soft delete was a big issue, right? Just how do we declare the server's doing soft delete versus hard delete? So a lot of conversation around lifecycle, because right now all you have is active, true, false. Now we all know that the lifecycle of a user, a lifecycle of an object is a lot more rich, a lot richer than binary is active or not. So I want to talk about like how do we express the state of an object a little bit more richly and standardize that, right? So that they are frozen, right? They're in a suspended state, but they're active, but they're frozen. Like, how do we get a little bit more richness around the life cycle state of the object? One of the things that trips people up is there's no cardinality in the schema. So a couple things this happens. We'll use this as an example. Everybody gets one profile in Salesforce, but I can't tell you that through the schema. There's no way for me to express you only get one of these things. All I can do is throw an error when you try to give me a second one of them. So that's kind of a bummer. There was also conversations around, well, there was a larger conversation around what's minimally viable. There's not really an easy way if I go and hit the endpoints to know, look, if you just hand me email address and last name, we're good, right? There's no good way of expressing that. And in some systems, and this is good, we had some folks from Okta who were saying, look, we had a bunch of ISV partners in, and these small SaaS apps, they only have 6 attributes. But if you go query the schema endpoint, that standard schema is like this, right? And they're going, well, I just get like first name, last name, email, and like 3 other things. Come on, there's gotta be a better way to do this. So I think we'll kick this around a little bit as like, what is an MVP indicator, right? Like just give us this and you're off to the races. And this manifested itself in terms of not only user objects, but groups, entitlements, et cetera. Like, what is that skinny user object I can put out there and get going? So we'll kick that around some more as well. Oh, as well, a couple other things. One, this came from Pam, which is, oh, great. So your service provider config says you authenticate using OAuth. Okay, well, which flow? Like, there's no statement there. All it just says is you're gonna use OAuth too, which is kind of like saying you're gonna use ones and zeros, right? It's like not particularly helpful. So can we enrich that? And another question, which is, how do we make discoverability better, right? How do I know where your SCIM endpoint is to begin with? Should we think about putting a pointer to your service provider config in .wellknown, as a for instance? So a little bit about how do we start bootstrapping this stuff a little bit more. How do I authenticate? Where do I go? Those kinds of things. And yeah. And so the other thing was, I certainly want to get to a point where we have conformance testing. And there's certainly some interest among the working group, and there's some interest from organizations that do that. Like, let's get to that point. But I think to get there, we need to run this set of tests again and add more that explores sort of all of SCIM, right? Not just provisioning, not just directory service, but the whole sort of thing. And that's going to probably require at least another interop event, I would imagine, right? We imagine that the test that we've run, that document's a living document. So what I'd like to do is, it would be fun to put some more granularity back in, run this thing again, and then do a readout, say at like Gartner IAM or something like that a couple months down the road where people have had a little bit more bake time, working groups kicked around maybe some things to tighten some stuff up. But continue to expect to hear about the testing as an ongoing process, and hopefully something that we can make available as a conformance test, because I know from going through the OpenID Connect conformance test, it was incredibly educational for ourselves as well as our customers, and it became a way that I could walk over the developers and be like, this is failing here. They're like, yeah, but the spec says blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, but we have a conformance test now. Like, we actually can not argue about semantics to be like, these are hard results. So that's what I have from just slideware. And apparently I have no batteries, so this is going to end very quickly. But it's a good opportunity to get comments from folks. And Gordon, if maybe you want to talk about some of your experiences or want to add some.
I just wanted to just clarify for Unbound ID, we do support the post search and the /me.
Cool.
So just for the record, Unbound ID supports a post search and a /me.
Doesn't. Matt, can you not trash the room, please? Thanks, Bjorn. But other people want to, we can sort of just have Kelly and Pam and I just kind of stand here and do questions, or if people want to explore other things, or if people want to explore things like bars, that's all available to you as well. This is your time, and it's late in the day. But basically, watch this space. The working group's got some other things we want to work on, both extensions like soft delete and tightening up at the spec. We'll figure out how to do that in the coming weeks. Otherwise, question? Hold on, we'll run a mic to you, just because I feel like making my colleague run to you with a mic.
So I'm a little new to SCIM,
Okay.
just reading it online, all this stuff.
Welcome.
Thanks. So you mentioned an example of, like, say, posting a user to a SCIM endpoint with like an email address, and then you make that same call a second time. What sort of like, is there a whole series of error returns that you would get for different things beyond just, like, say, a 404 or?
Yeah, absolutely. So in that case, I don't actually know the code off the top of my head, but you would basically get duplicate user ID. The user already exists. 409? 409? Resource exists. Yep. So the SCIM error format, and then there actually is format for that, has got the HTTP code along with essentially the description in SCIM context, essentially, is the way to think about it. So there is something a little bit more than just like, 404, good luck. Like, we try to help you out a little bit. Yeah. Other questions? Come on, make Matt run. Oh. Run, I said run.
So what the search operation, does it support wildcard or
Does it support?
a wildcard search or something
Yeah.
like begins with something and star?
Yeah, so it does support that, and filter does too, right? Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah. Yep. Contains. Equals.
And also, does it have a property for pagination?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
And so that when you get, there's a type of SCIM list results, essentially, and you can, in that, you get attributes on page size, things like that. So those are all there. Apparently Matt's tired. It's fun.
Yeah, I'm not moving anymore.
Cool.
Sorry.
All right, well, so that means since there can't be any more formal questions, informally we'll hang out and talk about this stuff. But thanks for your attention. Thanks for spending 2.5 hours with us in the afternoon to talk about plumbing and fun SCIM stuff. So look more from us soon. Thanks, everybody.